Hi everyone. Rule number 5 for most of you will be to not eat processed food. Now, I think this is kind of obvious and goes without saying, but let's just talk a bit about what is processed food and what's the problem. So, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that processed food is something that humans have got hold of and done something to. But there are different degrees of processing. And this was actually scientifically defined in about 2012 by a Brazilian nutrition researcher called Monteiro. And what he did in a quite scientific way, he came up with 4 categories of food. And it's called the NOVA classification of food. So group 1 is unprocessed food. That's the obvious stuff. It's like meat from the butcher, fruit and vegetables, anything that humans haven't done something to. Then group 2, NOVA group 2, is foods that like culinary stuff that we add to food to make it taste better. So that'd be butter, olive oil, I think salt is in there and maybe even sugar, but that's group 2. Then group 3 was things like tinned fish, sourdough breads, things where humans have processed it in some way for its preservation. So the sourdough, the yeast will preserve it a bit longer. Fish in a tin, it will stay on the shelf for longer. But they can still be relatively unprocessed. But the 4th group of foods that he came up with, NOVA Group 4, is what is termed ultra-processed food. You may have heard this talked about in the media. It's actually a scientifically defined group of foods. So NOVA Group foods they're the foods that you look at the ingredients list and the list is huge and you don't really recognise many of the foods. Now, they're the obvious ones, so let's say a Mars bar, Fruit Loops from the breakfast cereals, protein bars, muesli bars, but not something like milk because the ingredient is milk. Okay, so you've got your 4 groups of classification of food. And what happens since he's done this categorisation of food, nutrition research has slowly changed how it analyses foods and outcomes. So whereas previously we used to say, look at macronutrients and micronutrients, so how many carbohydrates or what amount of protein, or like what does vitamin B12 do, or how does vitamin D affect this? It's quite a granular approach. But since this Brazilian guy developed this classification system, we've shifted to a different type of research that says, if you eat this percentage of this type of food, what are the health outcomes? Now, in 2000 and I think it was 23, but it may have been 24, published in the British Medical Journal, so a very reputable journal, they showed that people eating more or significant amounts of this ultra-processed food compared to people eating the unprocessed food, there was a direct and significant association between all-cause mortality, so death, and all the top health conditions that we know about, heart disease, diabetes, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but essentially anyone eating higher amounts of these ultra-processed foods were having more health issues, and a direct and significant association. Now, these studies have only been done in adults, but just to put a sort of lens on it for kids, they don't have the studies yet, but kids in Western countries, so America, England, Australia, about 50 to 70% of their diets tends to come from this 4th category, ultra-processed food. Now, many people listening to this will say, well, I don't eat processed food, I eat very healthily. I eat ultra-processed foods because it's hard not to, and you can easily make mistakes. So, sourdough bread in the supermarket, unless you read the label, often the home brand supermarket ones will have ingredients that put them into the ultra-processed food category. Weet-Bix are technically an ultra-processed food. Any bread from the middle aisles of the supermarket, that's an ultra-processed food. Yogurt, any yogurt other than plain unsweetened yogurts is an ultra-processed food. And what are the other ones? Crackers, any sort of crackers, jats, most rice crackers, ultra-processed foods. Now, within that, there's obviously a range. Weet-Bix are far better for you than Fruit Loops, but the fact is they are, by definition, ultra-processed foods, and they have stuff in them that your grandmother wouldn't recognise in her pantry. So Weet-Bix has barley malt extract. Most of the supermarket breads will have is it soy flour or malted yeast extracts. And emulsifiers and thickeners are the classic ones, and natural flavours. Natural flavours may sound natural, but what is it? It can be almost anything, and it does make something an ultra-processed food. And why do we need natural flavours anyway? So the point of this rule, for all of you it's going to be slightly different, but the point is to move away from these processed foods, read the ingredients, do you recognise them? And to eat more of our food from this Group 1 category of unprocessed foods. Now, it's not hugely difficult to make meals out of these Group 1s, but it takes a shift in mindset. And that's why this rule is included in your 10 rules. I hope that makes sense. Thank you for listening, and as always, get in touch with any questions. Thank you.